Welcome to Notebook Summaries. Today we're diving into one of the most, well, honestly, one of the most unbelievable stories in all of corporate history.
I mean, think about it. How does a private company conquer an entire subcontinent? It seriously sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel, right? But it's exactly what happened. We're talking, of course, about the English East India Company and its wild transformation from just a trading firm into the actual ruler of India.
So, here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll look at how they went from traders to rulers, their conquest of the subcontinent, how their rule actually worked, the modernization and discontent that followed, the massive rebellion of 1857, and finally, the company's last chapter.
All right, first up, from traders to rulers. Now, to really get this story, you have to understand something crucial. The East India Company didn't show up in India with some grand plan for conquest. Not at all. It started out as a pretty humble trading venture, just looking to make a profit.
And for more than 100 years, that's exactly what they were, just one player among many. You can see here they got started in 1600, got rights for a factory in Surat, set up another in Madras, and leased Bombay. They were just patiently setting up these little trading posts on the coast, competing with the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, for spices, textiles, the usual stuff. Nothing about this really suggested what was about to happen.
But then, right around the mid-1700s, things started to change. The Mughal Empire was weakening, and the company, well, they saw an opening. The whole game shifted after two huge battles, Plassey in 1757 and Buxar in 1764. These weren't just any old military victories. This was the moment everything pivoted. This is when the company went from being all about commerce to all about conquest.
And that led to maybe the single biggest game changer in the company's entire story, the granting of Diwani-e-Desh. Basically, the Mughal emperor gave them the right to collect all the taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, some of the richest provinces around. All of a sudden, they had this massive, steady fire hose of cash. And what do you do with that kind of money? You fund a huge private army and build an entire government, all paid for with Indian wealth.
Okay, so now that they had Bengal's treasury in their pocket, the company kicked off a century of just relentless expansion across the entire subcontinent.
Take a look at this map. This is the situation in 1765. That little bit of pink, that's all they controlled. Just a few spots on the coast. They were a coastal power for sure, but definitely not a continental one. Not yet. Okay, now fast forward just 90 years, and wow, look at that. The difference between the two maps is just, it's stunning. It really shows you the insane speed and scale of what they pulled off.
So how in the world did they do it so fast? Well, they had a pretty clever two-pronged strategy. On one hand, you had good old-fashioned brute force, outright conquest. But on the other hand, they used some really shrewd politics. They'd get Indian rulers to sign these things called subsidiary alliances, which basically turned them into puppet states. The local ruler got to keep his throne, but the company was really pulling the strings.
And over the next century, the company's army just went to work. They fought a whole series of major wars. They took down the powerful kingdom of Mysore in the south. They dismantled the Maratha Confederacy, which was probably their toughest rival. And finally, they conquered the Sikh Empire up in the Punjab. One by one, any Indian power that could stand up to them was just knocked out.
Which brings up a huge question. How on earth does a private company, run by a bunch of guys on a board in London, manage a vast empire? Well, they built this surprisingly sophisticated and super efficient machine to run the whole thing.
And the lifeblood of that machine? Land taxes. The company came up with two main systems to get that money. In Bengal, they used local landlords, the zamindars, as middlemen. Down south, they went straight to the peasant farmers, the ryots. But really, both systems were designed to do one thing and one thing only: squeeze as much money as possible out of the land for the company's shareholders.
Now, this really gets to the heart of how they held on to all that power. By 1857, the company's army had over 300,000 Indian soldiers, or sepoys, and only about 40,000 British troops. Just think about that for a second. India was conquered for a British company by an Indian army, armed with British weapons and led by British officers. It's kind of mind-boggling when you put it like that.
All right, so in its final decades, the company's role started to shift a bit. They began these huge, ambitious projects to modernize India. But, and this is a big but, while they were doing that, they were also stirring up a whole lot of anxiety and discontent.
I mean, the pace of change was just dizzying. You've got railways popping up, the first telegraph lines, a standardized postal service, massive new canals, and on top of all that, they started pushing social reforms. They passed laws against ancient practices like sati and allowed Hindu widows to remarry. From their perspective, it was progress, but it was a direct challenge to centuries of tradition.
But you have to see this as a double-edged sword. Sure, the railways were an engineering marvel, but people also saw them for what they were, a way to move troops around faster to tighten the company's grip. And those social reforms, no matter how well-intentioned they might have been, a lot of Indians saw them as a direct attack on their culture, their traditions, and their religion.
And all that simmering discontent, this growing fear that a whole way of life was being wiped out, well, it finally boiled over. In 1857, it just exploded, and it shook the very foundations of company rule right to its core.
The spark that lit the fuse? It was a rumor that the new rifle cartridges given to the sepoys were greased with pig and cow fat, which is deeply offensive to both Muslims and Hindus. But that was just the trigger, you know? The real fuel for the fire came from decades of other problems. Princes who'd had their states taken away, landlords who'd lost their land, and just regular people who genuinely feared their entire culture was under attack.
So, the Great Rebellion of 1857. It was massive. And although it was eventually put down with incredible brutality, the damage was done. Even by winning, the East India Company had basically sealed its own fate. Back in London, the British government had completely lost faith in them.
The British government was just shocked by the scale of the violence, and they came to a simple conclusion. A private for-profit company just couldn't be trusted to run an entire subcontinent anymore. So, with the Government of India Act of 1858, they did it. They just liquidated the East India Company.
And just like that, the era of company rule was over. 100 years after it all really began at the Battle of Plassey, control of India was transferred directly to the British Crown. This was the birth of the British Raj, a new era of direct imperial rule that would last for another 90 years. So, where does that leave us? What is the company's legacy? Man, that is a complicated question that historians still argue about today. On the one hand, they brought modernization, railways, telegraphs. On the other, it was a century of exploitation and conquest. Was it one or the other? The real answer, as it usually is probably somewhere in that messy, complicated middle. The end of the company was really the beginning of the British Raj. If you want to see what happened next, you should definitely check out our other explainers in the South Asia History playlist. And hey, if you found this summary useful, do us a favor and subscribe to Notebook Summaries.